Everybody, my name is Ted Forbes, and welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. Today I want to look at another colorist, and I think this is a good episode to follow up last week's episode. If you are not familiar with last week, we talked about the wonderful work of Saul Leiter, who passed away recently. And Saul was an amazing photographer, and you don't have a lot of these guys who stand out as being colorists in the 1950s into the 60s. The main reason being is, especially in the 50s and before, photography was really considered, serious photography was always black and white. This is how magazine publications were dealt with. The art world didn't view color work as being serious photography at all. And so you really don't have a whole lot of active participants in that genre going on during this period of history. You do have a couple. There's definitely William Eggleston, whose work is probably, of the crew we're talking about, the least accessible. It's a little harder to get your head around sometimes. Some people have a real love-hate with it. You have Saul Leiter, who is very accessible, but at the same time pushing boundaries of abstraction and all the stuff we talked about last week. And today I want to talk about Fred Herzog, who I think is a wonderful photographer. Interestingly enough, because like the others, he worked in color, he didn't get a lot of notoriety until more recently. And his stuff, much like Saul Leiter, has this real nostalgic side to it. So looking at it kind of historically through a lens that, this work wasn't popular at the time, but it was done at the right time to come out now with this whole hint of nostalgia around it to be very accessible and very successful at the same time. Fred Herzog has a very interesting story. He's known as being a Canadian photographer, but he's actually German-born. Fred was born in Germany, in Stuggart, and his family left during the aerial bombings during World War II. Both of his parents tragically died, and he dropped out of school. Ended up, working on ships and various things, which brought him to Canada. Canada, he moved to Montreal and later Toronto, I believe, in 1952, and then ended up settling in Vancouver, which is the city that he's known for. He did a lot of street photography, and like I said, all this is color, and he had a really interesting style. He actually worked as a medical photographer at the time and was very active with the University of British Columbia, and that's kind of what he did to pay the bills. And, his success as a photographer, much like these other guys, came much later. I think Eggleston's really the one of this crew who really was accepted in a moment, really paved the way for what we see as color work now, when really at the time black and white was really the way to go. Anyway, if you're not familiar with Herzog's work, you're in the right place, and if you are, I hope that you enjoy this as well. But I want to go take a look now at some of the work of Fred Herzog. Okay, so we're going to use Pinterest once again to do this, and if you want to go look at this board on your own later and use it for your own research, you're welcome to do so. What you want to do is go to pinterest.com/Ted Forbes. That's my Pinterest account. Pinterest lets you organize in what they call boards, and you're going to see all my boards here on the account. If you go clear to the bottom, because that's where they put the newest ones, you'll see Fred Herzog. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up, and we're going to look at some of Fred Herzog's work. Now, as I mentioned before, Herzog was a German-born photographer, but did most of his work that he's known for in Vancouver, British Columbia, up in Canada. And so he's kind of known today as one of the premier Canadian photographers, and it's somebody that Canada must be extremely proud of because his work is amazing. Early colorist, so a lot like what you're going to see in Saul Leiter's work, but with a completely different bend on it. A lot of times you're going to see these kind of strangely muted and or oversaturated colors, particularly reds. And he shot a lot on Kodachrome, which was a slide process film that's not actually made anymore. But it gave his images a real specific look to them. And one, you have the nostalgia of just being in the 1950s. But two, this color work is something that we're not used to seeing because, as I mentioned before, color work was just not something that was considered serious in terms of photography at that time, which is really interesting to me in a lot of ways. But, historically, color took a while to become accepted, particularly in the fine art world. Now, another thing you're going to notice in a lot of Herzog's work is I think there's a nod, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, to American painters of roughly the same era. And I'm sure Herzog was familiar with their work, but I think Edward Hopper certainly comes to mind, and I think Norman Rockwell, to maybe a little bit lesser extent, comes to mind as well. And so, if you're familiar with the famous Hopper painting Nighthawks, which is the diner scene by night, this way that Herzog comes along and does a similar deal with his compositions where he is kind of bringing you into, it's street photography, but you're being brought into these establishments on the street sometimes. This is obviously the interior of, this barber shop, but also you're seeing the kind of the focal point of this is probably either arguably the heads on this wall or this man walking by in a top hat. And I think this is really amazing. It's really interesting because I do think there is that connection with some of Edward Hopper's work where you have this interior/exterior feel that's going on. on. Here's another one with these kids in front of a drugstore with all the Coca-Cola signs. You get a sense that the building is actually part, or the structure is actually part of the composition. It feels comfortable, it feels familiar, that kind of deal. Another very Hopper-esque image, and this is another one of my favorites of Herzog's, where you have the harsh light of either early morning, probably early evening, where the sun is setting, and the way that this gentleman who's walking across the street in the front and his shadow is framed up, and that composition is amazing. Beautiful golden light shot at the golden hour, and just simply beautiful. I think a lot like Saul Leiter, you're going to see Herzog had his favorite lighting conditions in here, and so you do see a lot of those, and this extreme evening, long shadowed, high contrast look. It really does a lot for color photography and really brings out quite a bit. But there are other instances too. Here's another. This is an interior, obviously, but this gentleman looked like he's writing a letter or something, and I think this is where you start to see Norman Rockwell creep in too, because some of his subjects you really do start to have this kind of personal connection with. Really interesting characters in a lot of ways. This is just a great profile shot of this guy working in the sunlight that's coming through the window. So, this has a lot less dramatic feel if it's the same portrait without that light. And I think that really holds up and makes something of this image. Another picture with some kind of funky characters in it too is this one, which I love. You have this guy in the foreground with, basically bandages, and looks like he either really had a bad shaving accident or is a boxer of some kind. And this woman kind of give him a scowl from behind. And, again, this Norman Rockwell kind of nature, or maybe Edward Hopper, where you start to personalize your subjects a little bit, and there's a quirkiness to them. And you start to see that a little bit. On the other hand, you do see a lot of anonymity or anonymous nature of some of these too. Wonderful, wonderful color images of this two women, this girl wearing the red hose, which is, probably a tie over a little bit to what you see in Eggleston's work, with the bright colors, particularly these reds, particularly with Kodachrome. And this is kind of a big hallmark of Kodachrome, as well as the way this dark green, which is complementary colors to the red, work together, and just the hues that they have in Kodachrome working with kind of this overcast lighting has a great effect. This gentleman walking in the snow is another brilliant image, maybe more on the Saul Leiter end of the spectrum as far as those kinds of things go. What's also interesting too, here's another kind of Hopper-esque scene with this guy who's eating at a table at a Chinese restaurant. And again, with the kind of personalization of the subjects and the characters that are going on with this, and it's really interesting. I guess it's a gambling hall with wedding photos in the front. And anyway, I don't know enough about the history behind some of these images, but they're simply beautiful and wonderful to look at. The other interesting thing too, for those of you who do live in Canada or who have been to Vancouver, a lot of these street corners are still there today, and they have changed just like any other city quite dramatically from the 1950s. And I simply love this because it really has a way of capturing, like if you compare this to what the street view is, it looks like two different cities. If you compare Vancouver in the early 50s to today. I love the typography on this studio movie theater over here with this ginormous S in the cursive. It's no longer there. If you look on Street View, you do see this building in the background. There's another shot of Herzog's that's from the same corner. Step back just a little bit. Let's see if I can find it. It's this one here. And you have this one with the same studio, the Astor Theater here in the background. And you have this Germain's restaurant with people going in. And I love these kids on the corner that are goofing around and looking across the street. It's just, again, it brings a little of that Norman Rockwell personalization, particularly with the children in this. Unfortunately, the street view now, the studio's gone. You see this large building, this 5-story structure behind it. That's still there. Germain's is now a Starbucks, of course. So, a lot of this is an era gone by. And I think what's interesting about this to me is I think it's important on some level for all of us, particularly those of you who do street photography or photojournalism, and that's kind of your thing, the social documentary kind of thing, is you are documenting a place and time. And what's interesting to me is guys like Herzog and Saul Leiter, for that matter, in some of the work that they've done, they've really captured that essence. And at the time, it was completely overlooked. People didn't think twice about their work because it was in color. It just was not considered serious work. And I think you could probably make that case for anything. When we're in the moment and you're doing something that's representing culture as it is today, sometimes you don't have that benefit of being able to look back on it. And I know that's kind of a weird thing to say, but I think that, guys like Saul Leiter and Fred Herzog here have had these late careers with this enormous body of work that they created 40, almost 50 years ago, that it has a place now because it's the nostalgia element. It's the remember when. It's the way they don't do things like that anymore kind of feel to it. And so I think that's important to remember is a lot of times, work that you're documenting culturally may be less significant because it's something that we're surrounded with and we see all the time now. But what will that work look like in the future is what I'm saying. So it'll be interesting to see what we look back at the current time like, because at the time, color photography wasn't as accepted, black and white was in, and a lot of these images were not really respected until years later. Anyway, I just find that kind of interesting and something to kind of think about. Anyway, that's the work of Fred Herzog. Once again, this is all on Pinterest. I have a board set up on here. So if you go to pinterest.com/Ted Forbes, and you can find my board on there, which is /Fred-Herzog. So anyway, once again, that is the work of Fred Herzog. So I hope that Herzog represents something that's a little bit different. And when I say that, we talk about street photography on here, and we've talked about the decisive moment before. And if you look at kind of this golden age of street photography and photojournalism and what was going on with that, and the guys like, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who really led the pack with all that, all that work is done in black and white and has a certain look and feel to it. And I think what's interesting about Herzog's work is because he is a colorist. And much like you see with Saul Leiter, there is an element that is heavily inspired by painting, and I think in a very different way. I think that Saul Leiter has this kind of abstract expressionist thing that he's influenced by, even though he's interpreting that into street photography. And I think that Fred Herzog really has this wonderful representation of Americana in his work. And like I said, you see similarities to people like, definitely Edward Hopper and, another great painter or illustrator, Norman Rockwell, who was real big at that time too. And it's really interesting how some of that comes through in photographs, because I think that's, it's a nod to those people in terms of style, but it certainly isn't copying it. I mean, we're already in a different medium. We're not painting, we're making photos. And you see what he does with interpretations of light that you are able to capture in photography very literally, which is, more interpretive in a painting side of things. So anyway, I think Fred Herzog is a very overlooked photographer. I think Saul Leiter has had a lot of notoriety in recent years, and rightfully so. He's amazing. And I think Fred's one of those guys who's deserving of much more. So anyway, if you're not familiar with his work, I hope this has been beneficial to you. And if you are, I hope that this got you excited to go find more. Again, I'll put everything on the Pinterest board so you can go see it there. And until next time, folks, this has been The Art of Photography. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.